In the forgotten back alleys of the city, where the shadows are deep and mercy is a foreign word, lived the man the street kids called the Stone. He was a ghost, a ragged shape huddled against the cold brick, known for only one thing: his absolute, unshakable stillness. He was the neighborhood's human punching bag. For the bored teenagers looking for a thrill, for the angry drunks stumbling home from the bar, the Stone was an easy target. He was a silent, unresisting monolith of suffering. They would taunt him, push him, and when the words weren't enough, the fists would fly. And the Stone? He never fought back. He wouldn't even run. As a punch came, he would move with a quiet, practiced grace, folding in on himself. He would turn his body, absorbing the blows on his shoulders and back, his arms coming up to form a tight, perfect shield around his head and face. He wouldn't make a sound, no cries of pain, no pleas for mercy. He would just wait, a stone anvil enduring the clumsy hammer blows until his attackers grew bored and left him bruised in the dirt. The people who saw it happen all thought the same thing. Pathetic, they'd mutter. A coward. Why doesn't he even try to defend himself? They saw a man who had been broken by life, a man with no fight left in him. But a young woman named Sarah, who worked the late shift at the diner across the street, saw something different. Through the steamy kitchen window, she didn't see a coward. She saw a puzzle. She saw a man whose defensive movements were too precise, too disciplined. He wasn't just taking a beating, he was performing a ritual, a grueling, painful, and deeply mysterious penance. One night, after a particularly nasty encounter, she brought him a plate of hot food. He took it with a single, silent nod, his eyes as empty and gray as the alley walls. She started doing it every night, and every night she would ask him the same quiet question. Why do you let them do that to you? And every night, he would give her the same answer, a deep, profound, and heartbreaking silence. Who was this man, and what terrible secret was he protecting with his own body? The nightly ritual continued. The food, the question, the silence. Sarah learned to read the man she still called the Stone, not by his words, but by the geography of his pain. She saw the fresh bruises layered over the faded white lines of old scars, scars that looked different, cleaner, as if they had been left by a professional, not a clumsy street thug. His hands were the biggest mystery. They were large and coarse, the knuckles swollen and flattened into strange, hard ridges, like the roots of an old tree. But it was the way he held them that was so strange. He always kept them slightly curled, almost protectively, as if he were afraid of them, as if they were two caged animals he was terrified of letting loose. One freezing winter night, one of the usual teenage tormentors slipped on a patch of ice while trying to kick him. He fell hard, his head cracking against the pavement with a sickening thud. He lay there, groaning, a dark trickle of blood starting to pool beneath his head. His friends, suddenly terrified, panicked and ran, leaving him behind. Sarah saw it all from the diner window and immediately called 911 before rushing outside. But the Stone was already moving. He unfolded himself from his huddle, moving with a speed and purpose that stunned her. He was at the boy's side in an instant. He didn't check for a wallet. He didn't kick him for revenge. He performed a series of swift, expert actions. He gently tilted the boy's head to clear his airway. His fingers found the pulse point on the boy's neck with an unnerving, practiced precision. He stabilized his head, telling him in a low, calm voice not to move. When the paramedics arrived, they found a ragged homeless man perfectly administering first aid to the very kid who had been attacking him moments before. "Where did you learn to do that?" one of the paramedics asked, impressed. The Stone just shook his head, retreating back into the shadows of the alley, his brief moment of action over.
He was a ghost once more. But Sarah had seen it. The calm in the chaos, the expert knowledge. It wasn't the action of a random person. It was the action of someone who had been trained. Someone who had been in high-stakes situations before. The puzzle of the man in the alley became deeper, more complex. The next day, she saw him again. And this time, the silence was different. There was a new flicker of something in his eyes. A deep, haunting sadness. "He's going to be okay," she said softly, referring to the boy. "They said he has a concussion, but he'll be fine." The stone looked at his own hands, turning them over slowly, studying the scarred knuckles as if they belonged to someone else. "Good," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He looked up at her, his eyes holding a universe of pain. "Sometimes," he said, his voice barely audible, "sometimes they don't get back up." That one sentence hung in the air between them, thick with unspoken history. Sometimes they don't get back up. It wasn't an explanation, it was a confession. From that night on, a fragile, unspoken connection formed between them. He still rarely spoke, but he no longer turned away when she came with the food. Sometimes they would just sit in silence for a few minutes, two lonely souls in a city that didn't care about either one of them. The alley became a strange, quiet sanctuary. Sarah's curiosity was now a burning obsession. Who was this man? This walking paradox of grace and brokenness, of discipline and surrender? One day, driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, she took a photo of him. It was a discreet shot from her phone as he was huddled in his usual spots, his face mostly obscured by shadows. It felt like a betrayal, but she had to know. She took the photo to the local police station, to an old desk sergeant she knew, a man named Henderson, who had seen everything the city had to throw at him. "Henderson," she said, showing him the photo, "I know this is weird, but do you know this man? He lives in the alley behind my diner. He gets beaten up a lot. He never fights back. There's something off about him." Henderson squinted at the grainy photo. He grunted, a look of vague, distant recognition on his face. "Looks familiar," he muttered, typing something into his old, clunky computer. Probably an old mugshot. Sarah waited, her heart pounding. She felt a strange mix of hope and dread. Hope for an answer, and dread for what that answer might be. The sergeant was silent for a long time, staring at the screen. The usual bored, cynical look on his face had been replaced by something else. A quiet, stunned disbelief. He looked back at Sarah, then back at the screen. "God," he whispered, so quietly she barely heard him. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Is he a criminal?" The sergeant shook his head slowly, his eyes still glued to the monitor. He said, "No, he's not a criminal. He's a ghost." He finally turned to face her, his expression one of profound, sorrowful respect. "Young lady," he said, his voice low, "the man in that alley, the reason he doesn't fight back, it's not because he can't. It's because he's the only one in the city who truly knows how." He pointed a thick finger at a black and white photo on his screen. It was a picture of a young man taken decades ago. He was handsome, his face radiating a quiet, dangerous confidence. He was stripped to the waist, his fists wrapped, a championship belt gleaming around his waist. The caption underneath was simple: "Jacob the Anvil Jones, undefeated heavyweight champion." Sarah stared at the screen, her mind struggling to connect the two images. The powerful, glorious champion in the photo, and the broken, silent man in the alley. It didn't make sense. "What happened to him?" she whispered. Henderson leaned back in his chair, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. He looked at her with sad, tired eyes. The old cop said, his voice dropping even lower. He had one last fight, the biggest fight of his career. He won. He became a legend that night. He paused, a shadow passing over his face. And he lost everything.
Sarah's world tilted. A champion? The broken, silent man in the alley who flinched at his own shadow was once an undefeated heavyweight champion? The story seemed impossible, a cruel joke. Lost everything? She repeated, her voice a whisper. What do you mean? What happened in that fight? Henderson's face hardened with a deep, ancient sadness, the look of a man who has carried a story for too long. He turned his monitor slightly so she could see the screen more clearly. He clicked a few times, pulling up an old, digitized newspaper article from the night of the championship fight. The headline was bold and triumphant. The Anvil reigns. Jones wins title and devastating knockout. Everyone remembers the victory, Henderson said, his voice low and heavy. But they forget the cost. Read the second paragraph. Sarah leaned closer, her eyes scanning the faded text. The fight, a brutal 15-round war, came to a shocking and tragic end in the 14th. Jones, who had been fighting a surprisingly defensive battle, unleashed a single perfect right hook that sent his opponent, Marco the Comet Riley, to the canvas. Riley never regained consciousness. He was pronounced dead on arrival at University Hospital from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. A 1 in a million punch, the coroner called it. A tragedy that has stunned the boxing world. The air left Sarah's lungs. The words blurred, the world narrowing to a single horrifying point of understanding. Sometimes they don't get back up. His words from the alley echoed in my mind, no longer a mystery, but a confession. He hadn't been talking about the teenage thug. He had been talking about the man he killed in the ring, the man whose life he had taken with his own 2 hands. My God, she breathed, stumbling back from the desk. He killed someone? He did, Henderson confirmed, his voice laced with a profound, weary empathy. The man you see in that alley, that's just a ghost that's left over. He pulled up another file. It was a picture of Jacob and another young man, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, smiling, holding up a smaller regional boxing trophy. They looked like brothers. They looked invincible. The other man had a bright, infectious grin. Who is that? Sarah asked, her heart aching. That's Danny, Henderson said softly. His best friend, his manager, his brother in everything but blood. They were a team, inseparable. He paused, letting the weight of the next words settle in the air before he spoke them. Marco Riley, the old cop said, his voice a final, devastating whisper. The man Jacob killed in the ring, that was Danny's younger brother. Sarah walked out of the police station in a daze. The city streets, once so familiar, now seemed alien and unreal. Every face she passed was a ghost. Every sound was an echo. The story she had just heard was a weight in her chest, a piece of someone else's tragedy that had now become her own. The stone, the anvil, Jacob Jones. He wasn't a coward. He wasn't pathetic. He was a man performing a lifelong penance for a sin he could never outrun. His stillness wasn't weakness. It was a cage he had built around the power so terrifying it had destroyed his entire world. His refusal to fight was not an act of surrender. It was an act of profound, heartbreaking strength. She understood now. The haunted eyes, the hands he was afraid of, the way he absorbed every blow without a sound. He believed he deserved it. Each punch from a street thug was a ghost of the one unforgivable punch he had thrown himself. That night, she went to the alley as usual, but everything was different. When she looked at him now,
Huddled in the shadows, she no longer saw a puzzle to be solved. She saw a man trapped in a memory, a king living in self-imposed exile, tormented by the ghost of his own crown. She sat down a few feet away from him, placing the bag of food on the ground between them. The usual silence stretched on, but tonight it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of her new knowledge. "I know who you are," she said, her voice so soft it was almost a part of the wind whistling through the alley. He didn't move, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. "I know about the fight," she continued, her own voice thick with emotion she couldn't control. "I know about Mark O'Reilly, and I know about Danny." For a long moment Jacob remained completely still, a statue carved from grief. Then a single shuddering breath escaped his lips. It was the sound of a wall, carefully constructed over 20 years, finally beginning to crumble. He slowly turned to look at her. The emptiness in his eyes was gone. In its place was a raw, naked, and bottomless ocean of pain. It was the first time he had truly looked at her, the first time he had let anyone see past the ghost. "Then you know," he whispered, his voice a ragged, broken thing. "You know why I can't, why I can never again." "It was an accident, Jacob," she said, her own tears starting to fall. "The whole world knew it was an accident." He gave a short, bitter, humorless laugh. "The world wasn't the one who made a promise to his brother," he said, his gaze turning inward, back to the memory that had been his only companion for 20 years. "I promised him I would protect his family. I promised him I would keep it clean. And in the end, I used his love for me as an excuse to unleash the worst part of myself. I didn't just kill his brother. I killed him too. I killed everything we ever built." He looked down at his own hands, the instruments of his glory and his damnation, with the look of pure, undiluted loathing. "These hands," he said, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper, "they don't build things. They don't save things. They only know how to break them. That's all they're good for." He finally understood. His penance wasn't just about refusing to fight. It was about his profound, unshakable belief that he had forfeited his right to ever be strong again. Their conversation, the first and only real one they ever had, was cut short by the familiar, ugly sounds of approaching trouble. The same group of teenagers, emboldened and restless, swaggered into the mouth of the alley. But this time, it was different. This time, Sarah was there. "Hey, look!" the leader sneered, his eyes falling on Sarah kneeling near Jacob. "The old man's got a girlfriend." "Leave him alone," Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm as she stood up to face them. "Just get out of here." The leader laughed. "Or what? You gonna call your boyfriend here to protect you?" He took a menacing step towards her. "I don't think so." He shoved her hard. Sarah stumbled backward, crying out as she fell, her head hitting the brick wall. And in that moment, something inside Jacob, something deeper than his grief, deeper than his promise, deeper than his own self-hatred, finally broke. It was the protector, the primal fundamental instinct that had started it all. The need to defend the innocent, the very instinct that had led him to throw the fatal punch for Danny, now roared back to life for Sarah. He rose from the ground. It wasn't the dramatic entrance. He simply unfolded. A ragged, silent figure stepping between the thugs and the woman he had come to see as his only friend. "Get out of the way, old man," the leader snarled, unnerved by the sudden change in the man's demeanor. He threw a wild, contemptuous punch at Jacob's face. Time seemed to slow down. Jacob saw the punch coming as if it were moving through water. He saw a dozen ways to counter, to devastate, to end the fight before it began. The ghost of the champion screamed within him, and the ghost of Danny screamed right alongside it. "Don't do it, Jake! Don't become the monster again!" He was trapped between two sacred duties: the vow to never fight again and the undeniable need to protect the person he had shown him kindness. And in that split second of impossible clarity, he finally found the third way. He did not dodge, he did not counter, he did not throw a punch. He moved into the attack. With a fluid, breathtaking grace, he stepped forward, positioning his own body to shield Sarah from any further harm. He took the clumsy full-force punch directly on his jaw. His head snapped back with the force of the impact. A sound, a sharp crack, echoed in the small alley. But he did not fall. He stood his ground, an anvil taking the blow, his feet planted, his body an unbreakable shield. He looked at the shocked teenager, his eyes no longer empty. They were filled with a profound, almost peaceful sorrow. And in them, the boy saw not a victim, but a champion, and he was terrified. The impact had been unnatural. The way the old man took it, it wasn't human. The teenagers, their courage instantly evaporating, turned and fled into the night. Jacob stood there for a moment, a silent, victorious guardian. Then a shudder went through his body. He brought a hand to his head, a look of confusion on his face. He swayed, and then he collapsed to the ground. Sarah rushed to his side, cradling his head in her lap. "Jacob, why? Why did you do that?" He looked up at her, his vision starting to fade. A small, faint smile touched his lips. That final punch, the one he had chosen to take, had caused the one thing a lifetime of beatings never had. It had triggered a second fatal bleed in an old, deep-seated brain injury. An injury he had sustained 20 years ago, in the 14th round of a championship fight. He had spent half his life running from the ghost of the man he had killed, and in the end, that same ghost had finally caught up to him. "Promise me," he whispered, his voice a faint breath, as his eyes looked past her, at something only he could see. "Promise me, you'll tell Danny I kept my promise." He didn't die from a thug's lucky punch. He died from his own. He had absorbed the final fatal blow that had been waiting for him for 20 years. He had finally taken the punch that he couldn't take back. And in doing so, the champion had finally found his peace.